This Old West story don't start with a gunfight. It starts with a woman on her knees in the ash of her burned down home, the word witch carved into what's left of the door. Nobody helped her. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, no one. Then just as the smoke began to fade, he rode in, dusty, alone, and carrying more ghosts than bullets. He didn't come to save her, but he saw the fire in her eyes and knew one thing for sure. Someone in that town needed killing. And it wasn't her. This Old West story ain't what you think. It's worse. This is Branded a Witch by Saddlehorn Stories. This Old West story didn't begin with a gunshot or a duel. It began with smoke. Thick, greasy, and clinging to the sky like it was trying to escape what happened below. The ground still smoldered, and the scent of burnt wood tangled with scorched sagebrush in the breeze. Where a cabin once stood, only ruin remained. But she, Isolde Kane, was still there. Kneeling in the soot like some forsaken saint, her palms blackened, her copper hair matted with ash. The word witch had been carved into what was left of the door, letters jagged and deep, like whoever did it wanted to scar the land itself. Folks from the town had gathered down the road, just far enough to pretend they weren't watching, just far enough to feel righteous in their silence. No one stepped forward. No one offered her water. And then came the sound of hooves. Slow, deliberate. One rider, no posse. He rode in with a dust trail behind him, a brown coat stiff from miles of road dust, and a hat pulled low enough to hide his eyes, but not the way he stared. He stopped when he saw the ruin, when he saw her. Calder Briggs wasn't a hero. Not anymore. Some said he'd been a bounty hunter. Others whispered he used to wear a badge until something happened that turned his soul to rust. What was true didn't matter. What mattered was the way his hand hovered near his hip when he saw the townsfolk watching like vultures. "You lost?" he asked, voice rough like gravel and whiskey. Isolde looked up, her eyes sharp beneath the grime. "Depends who's askin'." "Just a man looking for work and a drink." "You won't find either here," she said, voice dry and bitter. "Not if you talk to me." He dismounted. That alone was enough to make the onlookers murmur. Calder ignored them. He stepped closer, boots crunching over blackened timber, and held out his canteen. She didn't take it. "They'll burn you too," she said flatly. "I've burned before." Their eyes held, for one breath, then two. There was something there neither wanted to name, not trust, not yet. But something. Behind them a child cried out. A mother shushed her and pulled her away. A few folks turned their backs. A couple spit in the dirt. "You got a name?" he asked. "I did. Before they took it." Calder looked down at the word on the door. "Then maybe it's time you take it back." She gave the faintest smile, just the edge of one, and turned her face toward the smoldering wreck. "Only way to do that is with blood." And just like that, the air between them turned heavier than smoke. He didn't walk away. He didn't speak again. But he didn't leave either. Sometimes in the Old West, justice came late. Sometimes it came slow. And sometimes it rode in dusty, alone, and ready to burn the whole damn town down. The cabin kept smoldering through the night as if even the fire hadn't wanted to touch the place too long. Calder sat with his back against a log, hat low, rifle across his lap. Isolde hadn't said much after their first exchange, just crouched down in the rubble and sifted through it like she might find something whole. "You waitin' for something to come back?" Calder asked. She didn't answer at first, just held a small, charred locket in her hands. "I buried a boy here once," she said finally. "Not mine, but close enough." Calder didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Some stories were better left bleeding slow. The sun crept up behind the hills, casting gold across the land like it was trying to paint over the ugliness. But light didn't fix much in this kind of Old West story, not when you had ashes in your lungs and a target on your back. "Town still calling you a witch?" Calder muttered. She gave a short laugh. "Witch, whore, heathen, take your pick. Preacher makes sure they all sleep easier with their hatred tucked under their pillows." Calder took a sip from his canteen and passed it to her again. This time she took it. Their fingers brushed. It was quick, but heat flashed between them, sudden and sharp, like striking flint. "You got a plan?" he asked. Isolde stood and looked toward the town, face unreadable. "Yeah, don't die." She stepped past him, boots crunching in the soot. He watched her, the way her shoulders held tension, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from restraint. from holding in too much for too long. Calder rose and followed. "You going into town like that?" She glanced back, smirking. "They've already seen me burn. Ain't much else they can take." But he knew better. Folks like that? They always found something else to steal. As they crossed the edge of the valley, the town of Perdition came into view. Dusty streets, shuttered windows, whispers waiting behind every door. "You really think they'll try again?" he asked. She nodded once. "They don't just want me gone, Calder. They want to be right about me." He stopped walking. "Then they're going to need more fire." Their eyes met. For a long moment nothing else in the world moved. Her dress was torn, his coat was stained, both of them broken in different ways. But something passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but maybe the start of it. And in this place, this story carved from flame and grit, that was more dangerous than any bullet. The town came into focus like a wound that refused to heal. Perdition, they called it, though nobody remembered why. The place sat crooked in the valley, sun-bleached and broken. The buildings slouched like they were ashamed to stand upright. A crooked sign hung over the saloon, swinging in the breeze like it was trying to whisper something long forgotten. Calder led the way, but Isolde stayed close, not behind him, not beside him, just close. She didn't want his protection, but she understood what it bought her. Two riders walking into town together would get looks, but a man riding in with a branded witch? That stirred whispers, that lit fires. They passed the general store where two old men sat outside whittling wood into nothing. One of them spit and muttered, "Devil walks with her now." Calder didn't stop walking, but his jaw clenched. The sheriff stood on the boardwalk outside his office, arms crossed, star pinned like a threat. He was younger than Calder expected. Clean boots, eyes like wet stone. "Thought I told you to ride out," the sheriff said. "You did." Calder stopped. "I didn't listen. That a habit of yours?" "Only when I see fire where there ought to be justice." The sheriff stepped off the porch. "She's trouble, mister, and this town's seen enough of it." Calder's voice was quiet, but firm. "I ain't here for her." That was a lie, and they both knew it. Isolde didn't flinch under the stairs, but her eyes flicked toward the chapel at the end of the street. Her jaw tightened. "You planning to stay long?" the sheriff asked. "That depends," Calder said. "You hiring?" The sheriff gave a half smile. "We don't hire strangers." Calder shrugged. "Didn't figure you hired witches either." Isolde's hand twitched. A small motion, but Calder caught it. She hated that word, hated how easily folks threw it at her like a stone. They moved on without another word. But behind them, the sheriff's eyes burned into their backs. In front of the chapel, a preacher stood speaking to a small crowd. His arms were raised, voice booming, face red from the sun, or maybe from the fire in his veins. "Temptation walks among us," he roared. "Sin wears the face of a woman." Calder leaned toward Isolde. "That him?" She nodded once. "That's the one." The preacher caught sight of them. His voice didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed. Calder didn't blink. This town had secrets. Calder could smell it like he could smell rain on dust. And in stories like this, in places like Perdition, truth was a bullet most folks didn't want to bite. But Calder had already taken worse. They didn't speak much after leaving the chapel, not until they reached the slope behind the church where the graves leaned in the dirt like forgotten prayers. Calder followed Isolde in silence, the scuff of her boots against dry earth the only sound between them. She walked with purpose, but her shoulders were tight, like she was dragging old chains no one else could see. She stopped at the edge of a thicket, where an old fence sagged against a windless sky. There, half buried under a twisted mesquite, lay a charred piece of timber. It was black and cracked, but not natural, not from wildfire. "This is where they tied me," she said, voice low. Calder looked closer. His stomach turned. Iron shackles rusted to the wood, their shape warped by fire. Burn marks stretched across the nearby rocks like the fingers of hell had clawed up from the dirt. "They built it just for me. Middle of the night. Sheriff turned a blind eye. Town watched from up there." She pointed to a ridge overlooking the scene. "Didn't matter that I hadn't done a damn thing. All it took was one man with a collar and a lie." Calder knelt, ran his fingers over the soot-stained wood. "Preacher?" She nodded. "He said I'd bewitched him, that I tempted him into sin. Said he woke from a dream with my name on his lips and the devil in his heart, claimed I poisoned his sermons with lust." Calder's jaw tensed. You ever touch him? No, she spat, but I laughed when he tried to kiss me. That's all it took. She knelt beside him, her dress brushing the dirt. I wasn't supposed to live, but the fire wouldn't take. Wind came out of nowhere, blew the flame sideways. The rope burned through before my skin did. She pulled her shawl down from her shoulder and turned. Calder saw the mark then, branded into her back. Not just burned, but carved. A symbol, crude and jagged, seared right above her spine. What is it? He asked, his voice tight. They called it the Devil's Eye, she said. Said it would show the world who I really was. Calder reached out, hand trembling. He didn't touch it, just hovered close, like the heat of that night still clung to her skin. I know what it's like, he murmured, to carry a mark that won't let you forget. She turned her head, met his gaze. What did they do to you? He didn't answer. A crow called from a nearby post, its cry sharp and ragged. They both turned toward the town. Smoke still curled from somewhere behind the saloon. A new fire, or just the ghosts of the old one. Hard to say in a place like Perdition. You still think you can help me? She asked. No, Calder said, but I can burn the ones who hurt you. And in that moment, the look she gave him wasn't trust, but it wasn't hate either. It was something waiting to spark. Perdition's saloon had no music, no laughter, just the sound of boots thudding across warped floorboards and glasses clinking like nervous teeth. The place smelled of whiskey and old sweat, and when Calder pushed through the batwing doors with Isolde at his side, every pair of eyes turned. Conversations died like candles in the wind. Calder didn't flinch. He walked in like he owned the room, and folks stepped aside without knowing why. Isolde kept her chin high, but her fists were tight at her sides. This was no welcome. It was a warning wrapped in silence. Behind the bar, a stout man with a crooked mustache and a shotgun beneath the counter squinted. Didn't think you were fool enough to come in here with her. Calder stepped up and laid 2 coins on the bar. I'm thirsty, not stupid. The barkeep looked at Isolde like she was a disease. I don't serve her. Calder turned his head just slightly. Then don't serve me either. His voice was low, even, but dangerous. The tension crackled. No one moved. Isolde touched his arm. Let's go. But as they turned, a voice from the corner sneered. She got you under some spell, stranger? Maybe she burned your brains out already. Calder stopped. The man stood, tall and broad, face red from liquor and arrogance. A deputy's badge hung on his chest, tarnished and crooked like its owner. You best watch your mouth, Calder said. The deputy smirked. Or what? You'll draw on me? Over her? Isolde stepped forward, hand on Calder's chest, trying to hold him back, but her touch only sparked something hotter. Calder's pulse thundered. I don't pull for sport, he said, but I will for honor. The room was still. The deputy reached, too slow. Calder's hand moved like lightning. Steel flashed. The deputy's gun hit the ground, kicked from his hand by Calder's boot before he could aim. A single bullet buried itself in the floor between the man's boots. Next time would be different. Isolde grabbed Calder's face, sharp, sudden, and kissed him. Not tender, not romantic, just raw and calculated. His hat tilted back as her lips pressed into his, hard and fast, and in the confusion that followed she whispered, That kiss just saved your life. Now move. Calder staggered back, stunned by the kiss, the boldness, the heat of it all. She grabbed his wrist and pulled him through the saloon doors just as more deputies stepped in from the street. They ducked behind the water trough, both breathing hard. You set me up, he growled. No, she said, brushing hair from her face. I saved you. The second shot would have been yours. And your last. He looked at her, breathing heavy. Why'd you really kiss me? He asked. She looked away. Because if I didn't, I might have meant it. And with that, she walked off toward the churchyard, leaving him in the dust and the weight of something he couldn't name. The night came down hard over Perdition. No stars, no moon, just a blanket of dark so thick it pressed on your lungs. Calder lay awake on the floor of the old livery stable, one hand resting on the butt of his pistol, the other behind his head. Isolde paced nearby, restless, her bare feet whispering across the hay-strewn boards. You always sleep like that? She asked. He didn't answer at first, then low, only in towns where justice wears a preacher's robe. A long silence followed. Isolde finally sat beside him, her skirt bunched up around her legs. She didn't look at him. You ever feel like you're just part of someone else's story? Like no matter what you do, it's already written. And it ends bad? Calder turned his head. Sounds like an Old West story someone ought to rewrite. She almost smiled. Then they heard it. A horse. Just one. Hooves slow, measured. Isolde froze. Calder rolled silently to his feet. They crept to the stable door and peered through the slats. A rider in black passed through the center of town. Black duster, black hat, black horse. A face mostly hidden, but Isolde's breath caught like it had been punched from her chest. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the one that lit the fire." "You sure?" Calder asked, already reaching for his gun. "I'd know that horse anywhere. He had a white scar across its shoulder, like lightning." The rider stopped outside the preacher's house, didn't knock, just tied off the horse and walked in like he'd been there before. Isolde backed away from the door, her voice dropped to a tremble. "He wasn't just the one who burned my home. He was the one who told them where to find me." Calder frowned. "Who is he?" She didn't answer. He stepped in front of her. "Who is he, Isolde?" "My brother," she said. The words hit like a slap in the dark. "Half-brother. Preacher took him in after our mother died. Said he'd raise him right. Guess he did." Calder stared at her, then back toward the preacher's house. "You think he knows you're still alive?" "He knows." Calder cursed under his breath. "That explains why no one's ever come looking. You were never supposed to survive." She nodded. "He lit the fire. I saw his face when he dropped the torch." The wind picked up outside, dry and whispering. Somewhere a dog barked, then went quiet. "You still want to fight?" Calder asked. "I want to bury them both," she whispered. Their eyes met. No fear, just fire. Calder pulled his rifle from its saddle scabbard. "Then we start with the man in black." Out in the distance, lightning crackled behind the hills. And somewhere deep in the belly of Perdition, the preacher's plan twisted tighter around them both, like a noose they couldn't yet see. Morning broke like a slap, hard, bright, and unwelcome. The town of Perdition stirred with the kind of nervous energy that clings to a place just before a storm. Shop windows shuttered. Conversations hushed as Calder and Isolde walked side by side toward the edge of town, where a crude gallows sat like a scar on the land. It wasn't used often, but it was always ready. 3 crows perched on the beam, black eyes watching like they were waiting to feast. "What are we doing here?" Calder asked, eyes on the horizon. "Showing you something," Isolde said. She led him to a fence post where a small rag doll hung from a nail, swaying in the breeze. Calder frowned. It had red yarn hair and a burned hole through its chest. "They left it here after the fire," she said softly, "to remind me I wasn't welcome." Calder ran his hand across the rail. "They want you gone, but they're not running you out." "They want more than that now," she said. "They want a show." As if summoned by her words, a shout echoed from down the main road. A young boy, barely 8, ran barefoot through the dust, crying. His mother chased after him, pale-faced and panicked. "Please," she begged as she neared. "He's burning up. I didn't know where else to go." Isolde stepped forward, instinct overriding caution. She knelt beside the boy, placed a hand on his forehead, then glanced at Calder. "Fever. Maybe a spider bite. I can help." The mother nodded quickly, desperate, but whispers traveled faster than the cure. By the time Isolde pulled out her satchel and began mixing herbs, a crowd had gathered. "That witch is cursing the child!" someone shouted. "She's poison!" yelled another. Calder moved between them and Isolde, hand on his gun. "Back up!" The sheriff emerged from the crowd, eyes narrowed. "She touches that boy, and I'll hang her for it." Isolde didn't flinch. "He'll die if I don't." "You'll die if you do," the sheriff snapped. Calder looked at him, cold and calm. "Then you better get the rope ready now." The silence was a living thing. Calder pulled his coat aside, revealing his revolver. The crowd stepped back. The sheriff didn't move. "This ain't how a lawman acts," Calder said. "This ain't how justice looks." The sheriff's jaw twitched. Then finally he stepped aside. Isolde worked fast, whispering to the boy's mother as she crushed dried roots into a paste. The boy whimpered, then slowly quieted as the fever broke under her hands. When she finished, she stood and faced the crowd. "You want to burn me again?" she said. "Fine, but you watch me save your children first." No one spoke. Calder turned to the crowd, his voice rough. "You wanted an Old West story? One with witches and gallows and fire? Well, here it is. But you're the monsters in this one." And with that, they walked away, leaving behind only silence, and 3 crows still waiting on the gallows. The preacher's house sat high on the hill, watching over Perdition like a judge eyeing the gallows. The shutters were always drawn, even in the heat. A fence circled it, whitewashed, but rotting. On the gate, a cross dangled crooked from a nail, clinking every time the wind shifted, like it was warning folks to keep their sins to themselves. Calder had been watching the place since dawn. He didn't trust silence, not from men who spoke loud in daylight. And the preacher had gone quiet. That meant something was stirring. "You sure about this?" Isolde asked. "No," Calder replied, "but he's the only one who hasn't bled yet." She didn't smile at that. Her hands were shaking again. She hated that, the way fear snuck in through cracks she thought she'd sealed. But she followed him anyway because some ghosts needed confronting, even if it meant waking them. They didn't knock. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. The preacher sat behind a long wooden desk, bathed in the orange glow of an oil lamp. His Bible lay open before him, untouched. "I figured you'd come," he said without looking up. "You lit the fire," Calder said flatly. The preacher smiled. "No, I gave them the match. They struck it on their own." "You lied," Isolde said. "You damned me." The preacher looked up, and for the first time Calder saw the sickness behind his eyes. Not madness, something colder. "I told the truth," the preacher said. "The truth they wanted to hear." Calder took a step forward, hand near his hip. "She ever lay a hand on you?" The preacher stood. "No, but she refused me, and that was sin enough." The room went still. Calder drew his pistol, slow, deliberate. "You're going to answer for that." But the preacher didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and tossed a bundle of papers onto the desk. "Then you'll want to read this first," he said. Calder hesitated. Isolde grabbed the papers and scanned them, her face twisted. "They're land deeds," she whispered, "with my name forged." "Half this valley," the preacher said, "all hers, passed down through her father. She never knew. Her mother died before she could tell her. So I told the town she was cursed, had her branded, had her exiled." "Why?" Calder asked. The preacher's voice dropped to a whisper. "Because sin makes folks blind, Mr. Briggs. But fear lets you hold a whole town by the throat." Calder's hand tightened on the pistol. "You can kill me," the preacher said, "but the town won't follow you. They'll call it murder, and the land will stay in my name." He smiled. "Or you can leave. Take her. Start over. Forget this place." Isolde stepped forward, fire in her eyes. "And let you win?" "This ain't about winning," the preacher said. "It's about knowing when you've already lost." Calder looked at her. She looked back. The Old West story they were tangled in had no heroes, just survivors. And in that room, with the shadows creeping long and the truth laid bare, they had to decide what kind of ending they were willing to write. The next Sunday, the whole town of Perdition gathered under the sweltering sky. The pews inside the chapel were packed, but the real congregation stood outside, shoulders brushing, hats in hands, sweat running down spines. Word had spread fast. Isolde Kane was claiming ownership of land half the town had built on, and she had the deeds to prove it. The preacher stood tall on the chapel steps, robes spotless, voice thunderous, a Bible clutched in one hand, a silver cross in the other. "I warned you," he shouted, face flushed red. "The devil doesn't come with horns. He comes in the form of a woman." Gasps, nods, murmurs of which passed through the crowd like a fever. From behind the blacksmith shop, Calder and Isolde watched. "That man's trying to write the end of our story," Calder muttered. Isolde's voice was calm, but her jaw was tight. "Then we change the ending." She stepped forward before he could stop her. She walked right into the crowd, boots slow and steady over the packed dirt. Her presence cut through the murmurs like a blade. Women clutched their children. Men shifted, uncertain. Isolde reached the foot of the chapel steps and looked up. "You done talking yet?" The preacher froze only for a second, then sneered. "You've got no right to speak here, not in God's house." She held up the crumpled deeds. "This land says otherwise." He snorted. "That paper won't cleanse your sins, won't undo the fire you brought down, won't hide what you are." "I didn't light that fire," she said, voice rising, "but I sure as hell will finish it." Calder stepped up beside her, rifle slung on his shoulder, eyes locked on the preacher. "You telling them you forged those deeds too? Or just leaving that part out of your holy sermon?" The preacher's jaw worked. Isolde's gaze swept the crowd. You all called me witch, called me cursed, but the only curse in this town is fear. He fed you poison from the pulpit and told you it was scripture. The preacher shouted, You gonna listen to a woman who lured men to ruin? Calder chuckled darkly. You mean men like you? He tossed a small black book into the dirt, one of the ledgers they'd taken from the chapel office. Go ahead, read it. Lists every name he sold land from under, names of girls gone missing, deeds switched, signatures forged. The crowd shifted again, uneasy. The preacher's voice cracked. She seduced him, this outsider, turned him against righteousness. Righteousness don't look like branding women and stealing land, Calder said. That's not justice. That's just an Old West story written by cowards. The sheriff pushed through the crowd, face pale. He looked at Calder, then at the preacher. Is it true? The preacher tried to speak, but no words came. A single woman stepped forward. The mother of the boy Isolde had saved. She knelt in the dirt, eyes wet. She saved my son. Others followed. Some turned away. Some stayed frozen. The preacher raised his voice one last time. You'll burn for this. Isolde looked him dead in the eye. Then strike the match. And for the first time since she'd been branded, he had no fire left to give. The town of Perdition slept light that night, windows shuttered, lamps burning low, and rifles kept close. But Isolde wasn't sleeping. She moved like smoke through the back alley behind the chapel, her footsteps careful in the dust. Calder followed close behind, rifle slung low, hat pulled down. He didn't ask why they were here again. He already knew. Some devils don't die in daylight. The chapel door creaked as they slipped inside. The pews groaned in the dark. The altar loomed up like a shadow wearing God's bones. Isolde knelt behind the pulpit, pried up the warped floorboard with steady hands. Underneath, wrapped in faded cloth and tied with twine, were the preacher's real sermons, the ones no one was meant to hear. She unwrapped them one by one, ledgers, letters, maps with markings in red ink, names, locations, numbers. Calder knelt beside her. What the hell is this? Proof, she whispered. This is what he's been hiding. She held up a yellowed list of names, girls, ages, dates. These aren't baptisms, she said. These are sales. Calder's stomach turned. Trafficking? She nodded once. Most of them were orphans, or called witches, just like me. Calder ran a hand through his hair, jaw clenched so tight it trembled. He reached for another letter and stopped cold. His sister's name, Josephine Briggs. He stared at it like it was burning through his skin. She was one of them, Isolde said quietly. He sold her. Calder stood suddenly. The rage in him was silent, but heavy. He walked to the stained glass window and pressed his hand to the cool glass. I looked for her for 5 years, he said. Always figured she ran off. Couldn't live with the kind of men our father was. But this... He turned, eyes wet. This is worse. Isolde stepped close. We use this. We show it to the town. They won't follow him after this. Calder shook his head. They already chose their side. She put a hand on his arm. Then we give them a reason to change their mind. But before he could answer, the wind shifted. Smoke. Not from memory, real smoke. They spun toward the front door. Flames licked up the chapel walls like the place had been dipped in oil. He lit it, Calder growled. He knew we'd come back. The exits were blocked. Isolde yanked the floorboards up wider. Here! Crawl space! They dove into the hollow beneath the church just as the roof groaned above them. Heat poured down. Firelight painted the wood like blood. As they crawled out the back through a root-tangled hole, Calder looked up once more at the chapel burning behind them. Another chapter in an Old West story, he said grimly, where the righteous keep the matches and the guilty get the gallows. Isolde coughed, her voice rasping. Then it's time the guilty got the fire too. And behind them the preacher watched from the shadows, face glowing in the firelight, lips moving in silent prayer. For himself. Thunder rolled in low over the hills like a growl in God's throat. The clouds hung thick and black above Perdition, but the storm wasn't just in the sky, it was coming down the street. Calder walked at the front of it, rifle slung tight across his shoulder, face carved from stone. Beside him Isolde kept pace, hair whipping in the wind, fists clenched, her shawl pulled tight against the rising dust. The townspeople felt it in their bones, change, reckoning. At the edge of the square, the sheriff stepped onto the boardwalk, hands loose at his sides, boots planted like roots. Behind him, half a dozen deputies fanned out, rifles visible, nervous fingers twitching. "You're both under arrest," the sheriff called, voice barely carrying over the wind. "For what?" Calder asked, eyes hard. "Arson, theft, blasphemy, you name it." Isolde held up one of the ledgers. "You mean evidence?" The preacher stood behind the line of lawmen, expression unreadable, one hand resting on a Bible, the other gripping a hidden matchbox in his coat pocket. "We got witnesses," one deputy barked. "We've got names," Calder fired back. "Girls that went missing, families robbed blind, land stolen. Your preacher's ledger tells every part of this Old West story page by page." The crowd had gathered again, faces weathered by sun and secrets. Some looked away, some didn't blink. Then something happened. The black-clad man, the one Isolde called her brother, stepped out from the shadows behind the preacher. His face was pale, jaw set, a rifle hung loosely at his side. He said nothing. The preacher glanced at him once, uneasy, then Calder drew. One smooth motion, quick as a blink, his rifle aimed not at the sheriff, not at the deputies, but straight at the preacher. "You light one more match," he said, "and I'll put you down before the flame takes." The sheriff tensed. The preacher's fingers twitched inside his coat, and then, bang! A shot rang out. But it wasn't Calder who fired. It was Isolde's brother. The preacher stumbled back, a hole blooming in his chest. The Bible hit the ground first, then he followed. Gasps, screams. The deputies froze. The sheriff looked at the boy who'd once been his altar assistant, now holding a smoking rifle and shaking like the world was falling apart. I saw it," the young man stammered. "What he did. I helped him hide it. I thought he was saving me, but he was using me." No one spoke. Calder slowly lowered his rifle. Isolde didn't cry. She just walked past the preacher's body and dropped the forged land deeds on his chest. "Let him keep what he stole," she said coldly, "in the ground." The sheriff looked around, then stepped aside. The storm broke overhead. Rain came fast and heavy, washing blood and ash into the dirt. In the distance, the church continued to smolder, glowing faint behind sheets of falling water. And just like that, Perdition began to change. Not fast, not easy, but enough to rewrite the ending of one Old West story. The rain didn't wash the preacher's blood away. It only spread it. By morning, the town was still, but it wasn't peace. It was aftermath. Calder sat hunched inside the old barn, bandaging a fresh wound high on his arm. Not deep, but it burned like hell. The bullet had come from the chaos. No one saw who fired it. But he remembered the sound, the heat, Isolde's scream, then her dragging him through the mud, into the dark. Now thunder still rolled over the valley, though the sky had calmed. Inside, it was just the two of them. Her hands were steady, her eyes not. "You should have let me burn that church alone," she said softly. Calder winced as she tied off the cloth. "You're welcome." "I didn't ask." He looked up at her. "Didn't have to." She sat back on her heels, arms crossed, soaked dress clinging to her skin. The air between them was thick again, not just from heat or tension, but something else, a kind of wanting. Not lust, not yet, but need. "I killed a man once," Calder said, breaking the silence. "For less than what the preacher did?" She nodded. "So did I." He blinked. "I was 13, she said. "A man came through our camp. Thought I was easy. My brother stopped him at first. But he came back when no one was looking." She looked at Calder. "I didn't scream. I grabbed the fire poker." He didn't speak. "I buried him behind the river bend. Told no one." She laughed once, dry. "First time someone called me a witch came a week later. Maybe they weren't wrong." "You're not a witch," Calder said. "You're what's left when the world forgets how to love something it can't control." Their eyes met, and the space between them finally cracked. He leaned in, slow. Her breath caught, but she didn't stop him. Their foreheads touched. Nothing more. Not yet. Because something bigger still waited. "Preacher's gone," Calder murmured. "But the others who backed him, they're still here." "They won't go quiet," Isolde said. "No," he agreed. "They'll wait, reload, retell the story with you still as the villain." She stood, eyes burning now. "Then we change the story again." He rose with her, limping slightly. "What about your brother?" "He needs time. He's broken in places I don't know how to reach." You still love him? Enough to forgive, not enough to trust. They stepped into the gray light, the smell of wet earth heavy in the air, smoke still curled from the ruins behind them. And in the silence of a town reeling from the truth, Calder realized something. This wasn't just an Old West story about fire and revenge. It was about what happens when the fire dies, and you're left standing in the smoke, trying to decide what kind of person you'll be when the world starts looking again. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in that choice. The storm passed, but the town didn't dry, not really. Something lingered in the air, heavier than rain, thicker than smoke. Guilt, truth. The kind of silence that settles on a place after the mask is ripped off and everyone sees what's underneath. Calder and Isolde didn't ride out, not yet. Instead, they walked straight into the saloon that morning. Two figures that had been hunted, hated, and nearly burned. Now they were the ones holding the flame. Every chair turned, every glass stilled. Isolde stepped forward, dirt-stained and raw, hair wild, boots wet with the storm. She unrolled the preacher's ledgers across the bar and slammed them down. "Read it," she said to the townsfolk. "Every name, every lie, every girl he sold to men you thought were holy." A few of the men stepped back. A few didn't move at all. The barkeep eyed the pages like they were cursed. "Why bring it here?" "Because this is where it started," Calder said. "Right here, in your silence, your drinks, your backroom deals. Every man in here paid for peace, and you paid for it with her life." He nodded to Isolde. No one answered. Not the blacksmith, not the banker, not even the sheriff, who stood in the corner, his badge pinned crooked and tarnished. "You let them brand me," Isolde said. "Watch them tie me up like a dog and burn my name into wood." Her voice cracked, just once, but she didn't blink. "You let a man carve witch into my skin because it was easier than believing he was the real devil." A man at the table near the wall stood slowly, his face gray, eyes wet. "My daughter. She ran off last year. We thought she left on her own." Isolde pointed to the ledger. "Her name's on page 7. He sank back into his chair. Isolde turned to the sheriff. "And you? You gonna arrest me now? For not dying when you wanted me to?" The sheriff looked down, not ashamed, just beaten. "I should have stopped it," he muttered. "You still can," Calder said. "But it don't start with regret. It starts with justice." And with that they walked out. Isolde led Calder to the edge of the cemetery. Not the one in the churchyard, the other one. The field where those who didn't belong got buried without stone or name. There she planted a crude wooden cross, her fingers cutting into the raw grain. "What's this for?" Calder asked. "For every girl who vanished," she whispered, "for every woman they silenced, and for me, the part of me they tried to kill." Calder stood beside her. "You ain't cursed," he said. "You're the reckoning." She gave a tired smile. "Not much of a happy ending, is it?" He shook his head. "No, but it's a true one." She looked out across the field, eyes glinting in the sunrise. "They'll tell this like an Old West story one day," she said. "Only this time the witch didn't burn, she lit the fire." They found the sheriff by the water tower at sundown, sitting on an overturned feed bucket, staring out at nothing. His badge lay on the ground beside him, half covered in dust. The rain had cleaned the streets, but not the memory. Calder approached slow, boots crunching the gravel. Isolde hung back, arms crossed, her shadow long and sharp in the last of the day's light. "You come to kill me?" the sheriff asked without turning. "If I wanted to, I wouldn't knock first," Calder said flatly. The sheriff chuckled, a tired sound, more breath than humor. "I didn't know how deep it went. That's what I tell myself, that I didn't see it all, but I saw enough." Calder said nothing. The sheriff picked up the badge, turned it in his hand like it was a sin he couldn't wash off. "This used to mean something. My father wore one just like it. Said it kept wolves at bay. But I was the wolf, wasn't I?" Isolde stepped forward now. "You weren't the wolf. You just left the gate open." That hit. The sheriff bowed his head. "I can't take back what I didn't stop," he said, "but I can stop what comes next." He held the badge out to her. "Take it," he said. "The town needs someone with a backbone." She stared at it, didn't move. "I don't want to be law," she whispered. "Law burned me." Calder stepped in. "Then take it for every girl who never got to speak, every mother who buried a daughter with no answers. Wear it not for what it was, but for what it never became." Isolde reached out, slowly, took the badge. It was heavy, colder than she expected. The sheriff stood. "They won't all follow you." "I don't need them to follow," she said. "I just need them to see." They left him there, under the darkening sky, as the wind kicked up the dust again. Later that night, Isolde tacked the badge to the preacher's cross. Not out of respect, but as a warning. This chapter of their Old West story wasn't about revenge. Not anymore. It was about justice rising from the ashes of silence. And as she stood there, wind in her hair, firelight flickering in her eyes from the lantern beside her, Calder saw something holy in her that no preacher ever could have understood. She wasn't law. She was reckoning. And Perdition would never forget her name again. Perdition never had a proper graveyard, just a patch of earth behind the ridge where markers were more rock than name, and most of the dead were buried shallow, without fanfare. That's where Calder and Isolde rode the next morning. Quiet. No talk. Just the creak of leather and the soft clop of hooves in damp dirt. They came to bury the ledger, wrapped in oilskin, tied tight. It held everything, the preacher's secrets, the town's shame, the weight of a dozen broken girls whose names would never be sung. It didn't belong in court. It didn't belong in the hands of men who'd use it like currency. It belonged in the earth. "Here," Isolde said, stopping beside an unmarked grave. This one was hers. Her name was Lydia. They branded her a whore. She was 14. Calder said nothing, just knelt down and started digging with his hands. They buried the ledger deep, beneath stone and soil, then stood together, hands dirty, backs sore, sun rising slow behind them. "You sure about this?" he asked. "That book could ruin more than this town. That's power." Isolde nodded. "Power's the reason they did what they did. That ledger would only invite more of the same. It's done now." She lit a small fire beside the grave, not to burn the truth, but to mark it, to let the world know someone had remembered. They sat beside it, legs stretched out, arms brushing. Not lovers yet, but close, maybe closer than either had ever known. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. He nodded. "Every day, but something always pulled me back." She looked at him. "What pulled you this time?" He gave her a slow, tired smile. "You." A long silence. Then she whispered, "You know they'll still call this witchcraft. They'll say we cursed the town." He nodded again. "Let 'em. Every Old West story needs a villain." She laughed, and for the first time it didn't sound bitter. They watched the smoke rise, twisting up into the sky like a final prayer. Not for redemption, not for revenge, just a prayer that someone, someday, would tell the story true. And maybe, just maybe, someone would believe it. Not the version where the preacher was a hero, not the one where the law saved the day, but the one where a woman, branded a witch, rose from the ashes, unburned, unbent, and unafraid. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need a pulpit. It just needs someone brave enough to speak it. They left at first light, not because they had to, but because they'd done what they came to do. Perdition would never love Isolde. It might never even forgive her, but it would remember her. And sometimes that was more powerful than being loved. Calder saddled the horses while Isolde stood at the edge of town, staring down the crooked main street. The saloon, the chapel ruins, the faded sign that read mercantile with half the letters missing. Everything looked smaller now, not less dangerous, just less important. "You ready?" Calder asked. "No," she said. "But let's go anyway." They didn't speak as they rode out, past the last fence post, past the graves, past the river that still smelled like ash. Half a mile out, she turned to look back. Perdition was shrinking behind them, swallowed by dust and sunrise. "Do you think they'll change?" she asked. Calder kept his eyes forward. "Some might, others won't. But you gave 'em the truth. That's more than most folks get in a place like that." She rode in silence for a while, wind pulling loose strands of hair around her face. "You know," she said finally, "when they tied me up, when they dragged me through the streets, I thought that was the end of me. I thought that was the whole story." Calder turned to her. "That wasn't the end. That was the fire. The story started when you stood back up." They rode into the hills, the trail winding narrow and steep. By mid-morning they paused near a rocky overlook, the desert stretching wide and open beneath them, nothing but sky, dirt, and the promise of something new. "Where we headed?" Isolde asked. Calder shrugged. "Anywhere that ain't afraid of a woman with a spine." She smiled at that. "A real one this time." "Sounds like a rare place." Then we'll build it, he said. She looked at him, softer now. You really think we can? I don't know, he said. But I know I'd ride through hell again if it meant standing beside you. They didn't kiss. Not yet. They just sat there a while, side by side, as the wind rolled over them like the last page of a book. And as they disappeared over the rise, the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the desert. Two riders on a trail that wasn't written yet. But folks would talk. They always do. They'd say it was an Old West story, about a drifter and a witch, about fire, betrayal, and a badge that meant nothing, until it meant everything. They'd get some of it wrong, but the part that mattered, the part where she didn't burn, that part they'd remember. If this story gripped you, stirred something deep, or made you feel like you were riding right beside them, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to Saddlehorn Stories for more tales that dig into the heart of the frontier. We've got plenty more where this came from, each one packed with grit, heart, and fire. Don't miss the next Old West story that'll leave you breathless.